It is now my pleasure to introduce the Associate Director General of Civil Aviation Canada, Andy Cook. With more than 30 years, where's Andy? Here he is. Come on up. Okay. We'll put you over here. Round of applause, please. All right, we'll get you a seat. I'll get you in the seat. You just maybe stand over here and let you go. All right, thank you. With more than 30 years of aviation management, training, and operations experience, Associate Director General Cook most recently held the position of Manager of Strategic Analysis and Solutions in the Defense and Security Division of CAE. With extensive management experience, he has commanded across the breadth of military air operations, from small single-role detachments to the wing-based level of more than 1,000 persons. Been in that world. That's not easy. That is tough work. Associate Director General Cook holds an airline transport license and a Master of Military Operational Air and Science from the United States Air Force University and multiple bachelor's degrees. Please join me in welcoming Associate Director General Andy Cook.
Thanks very much. Yes, appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you very much, Joe. I really appreciate it being here. It's wonderful to be here. I'm just going to take out my speech. I really want to thank ALPA for the great organization here. Failure to plan. I didn't print out my speech before I left Canada, so I had it on my Surface tablet. I had it on my iPad. I had multiple electronic sources, but I'm a bit old school. I read old, and so you guys had a printer handy, so thank you for the great organization. I really appreciate it. So I'll just get going here. So good afternoon, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this year's ALPA Air Safety Forum. I'm pleased to be here in beautiful Washington, D.C. to share some thoughts from a Government of Canada perspective in the realm of air safety. I'm even more happy to be back in the U.S. I haven't left Canada since the pandemic hit, and while I love my country, as you love yours, I have to say the U.S. has a special place in my heart. As a former pilot in the RCAF, I had the occasion to spend a year in your beautiful country at Maxwell Air Force Base near Montgomery in 2008 and 2009 as a student at the United States Air Force Air Command and Staff College. My wife and I made many special friends in Alabama, and I learned a couple of lessons there. Firstly, Southern hospitality is real. And I learned a couple of interesting local customs. The first was the respectful way of greeting. I was Mr. Andy to the local kids. My beautiful wife was Miss Tracy. And I quickly learned an interesting icebreaker in Southern conversation, at least in Alabama. When I was first asked, "Who you for?" and I didn't really understand what that meant. I was at a bit of a loss. Then I learned the intense rivalry between Alabama and Auburn. And I don't want to spark any civil unrest here at the ALPA Forum, and I'm hoping that I'm far enough north that I can now say this safely, but roll tide. Okay. Okay, there's some Auburn fans out there. I also completed the USAF Air War College by correspondence from Maxwell, so I have the privilege of being one of the few former RCAF officers to have completed both senior command and professional development courses from the United States Air Force, and my sincere thanks for that great honor. But before I get to the meat of my speech today, I'd like to send the best wishes and regrets of my boss, Nick Robinson. Nick called me about 10 days ago and said he'd likely be unable to attend ALPA, and he asked me if I'd be willing to go to DC on his behalf. And I readily accepted, but I wondered why Nick would relinquish such a prime speaking opportunity. Now, Nick would tell you that it was because he was about to be promoted, which happened yesterday, and congratulations to him, promoted to the Assistant Assistant Deputy Minister, sorry, it's a mouthful, of Safety and Security at Transport Canada. And while that promotion is well-deserved, and it may have played a role, I think the enormous pressure of following Ambassador Sullenberger in the speaking order may have also factored into his decision. And I know the ambassador was unable to attend yesterday, and that is a real sad loss. But seriously, I know Nick would love to be here today, and he did ask me to send his warm wishes and best regards for this very prestigious event. Now, I'm cognizant of being in the room with many of the most talented and highly trained pilots in the world, most of whom have probably exceeded my approximately 5,500 flying hours many times over. So I think I'd like to start with a little I learned about flying from that story because I think it's apropos to my message. So I'm going to deviate from my script here a little bit. So here's my I learned about flying from that story. I was a fairly new major in the Canadian Air Force, flying C-130s at the time. Yeah? Right on, the Lockheed Hilton. And flying over Afghanistan. And we had a minor, a bit more than a minor, but a malfunction in the front end. It was sort of avionics related, or it was a front end problem. So, I've always prided myself on being a good crew captain, and, I would usually take every scenario around the crew, but, this was very front end oriented, so I asked the first officer their opinion, the nav and the flight engineer. And then at the end of that discussion, we made a plan, and then I briefed the loadmasters on what the plan was. And regardless, what the loadmasters heard was, well, we kind of want to get on the ground as quick as we can, so we're closer to Kabul, so we're not going to turn back to Dubai. Let's press on to Kabul. It's about 45 minutes north of where we were. And then the next thing I heard on the intercom was, left seat, load. I was like, yeah, go ahead. And he goes, why weren't we included in that discussion? And I said, hey, nothing, no disrespect, nothing personal, didn't mean anything by it. It was very front end oriented, and that was the only reason. There was no disrespect intended. And he goes, yeah, okay. So I heard you say that we should land pretty soon, if you can. And I said, yeah, so that's why we're going on to Kabul. He goes, yeah, okay. So I'm just looking at the right wing, left seat, and there's a big-ass airport right over there, about 10 miles. And we were sorry for that word, but that was a direct quote. And we were right overhead of Kandahar. And Canada wasn't flying into Kandahar at that time, but the airport was open. Thanks to our NATO partners, it had been secured, and it was available for an emergency, and we had one, and so we were able to land. And so the lesson I learned, I would have told you before that event that I was a good crew cockpit, crew concept flyer, but I wasn't good enough. And the lesson I learned from that experience was that, no matter what the scenario is, you take it to the whole crew. And someone, they may not have the expertise in the system, but they may have that good idea that you didn't think of. And by working together, you'll get the aircraft to destination safer than if you don't work together. And that crew concept it forms part of my very being as an administrator, and I believe that you guys form part of my crew, and I'm really pleased to be here. So, thanks. And I don't know how many people have flown with Loadmasters before, but they're not the kind of people you want to anger. I'll leave it at that. So, fair enough. So, how is that relevant to me today? So, as a regulator, we need to listen to the highly trained and motivated individuals who are part of our metaphorical crew. I consider regulators, operators, and professional associations like ALPA part of my crew. And I don't hesitate to lean in on our Canadian President, Tim Perry, for his advice. Tim, I know you're probably in the room somewhere, so thank you very much for that great advice. He's always at the end of the phone, and I truly appreciate it. Regulators can't always align fully with either operators or associations, but without the assistance and the advice of both of those, we would be at a great disadvantage. So I'd really like to publicly thank Tim and ALPA and all the other professional organizations with which I deal regularly. We're usually very aligned on most matters of aviation safety, and that is great to see. We are truly a crew working together. When I heard that this year's conference theme would be on perseverance, it made me think back to what the industry has been going through over the past 2 years. The year 2020 started off on a high note, but we all know what came after. The onset of COVID-19 forced the world to impose international travel restrictions. It slashed global demand from travelers and generated massive layoffs in the air and tourism industry all over the world. This had devastating impacts for airline employees and passengers whose movements were now restricted to a minimum, and you all know that more than anyone. The public health measures taken by Canada at the heart of the pandemic profoundly affected the Canadian airline industry. The closure of the Canadian border to non-essential travelers, the restriction of the arrival of international flights to our 4 main airports, the obligation for passengers to undergo PCR and antigen tests, and so on, all of those discouraged and prevented many people from traveling. Throughout the crisis, Canada found itself in the delicate position of promoting air travel while minimizing the risk of disease transmission to travelers and Canadian citizens. We made difficult but necessary decisions that had profound impacts on the industry, and we do recognize that. As an example, following the recommendation of the Public Health Agency of Canada, we restricted access to Canadian airspace for flights from countries where the presence of COVID-19 threatened the health of travelers and Canadians. Our colleagues in the aviation security branch imposed additional burdens on air carriers, including mandatory temperature checks and verifying the vaccination status of passengers. And we understand those measures took a very big toll on the industry. We also understand the frustration when those restrictions were imposed. But I want you to know that in every decision that Canada has taken in the past 2 years, the interest of the industry was always listened to. Despite all these challenges, here we are, gathered today in person, more than 2 years after the start of this pandemic. And although we can't say for sure that all of the crisis is behind us, I think the prospects for the industry are great. In its latest long-term pilot and technician outlook, Boeing estimated that there's going to be a need for 602,000 new pilots, over 600,000 new aircraft maintenance technicians, and almost 900,000 new cabin crew members to fly and maintain the growing commercial aviation fleet over the next 20 years. Those numbers are staggering. You only have to look at current bottlenecks at major airports around the world, including some notable ones in Canada, to witness the strong demand from travelers, and we'll get to that in just a little bit. The fact that most carriers are still working and serving customers today illustrates one thing. The aviation industry is resilient. Carriers have made it through this pandemic, and they will go on to get through other hardships in the future, just like they have in the past. But on my end, I believe that 3 key elements are helping governments and industry to recover from the pandemic, and I'd like to just expand on those a little. They are, number 1, the close collaboration between Transport Canada, other federal departments, and industry throughout the pandemic. Number 2, the implementation of targeted measures to help the industry. And number 3, the fact that Transport Canada kept its agenda moving while managing the impacts of the pandemic. And we'll take a look at each one of those individually now. So collaboration between governments and industry. Firstly, as you're probably aware, since the beginning of the pandemic, the Government of Canada supported and collaborated with the Canadian aviation industry and air transport stakeholders, including the Canadian Airports Council, the National Airlines Council of Canada, major airports and air carriers across the country through various forms and direct communications. An example of this collaboration would be the COVID-19 Recovery Working Group, and yes, I am a bureaucrat. We have a working group for everything. But that was a working group that involved the federal government and air industry reps to facilitate the coordination and solicit input on existing and future border measures and exchange ideas on the future of air travel. And most important to this gathering, our major pilot associations, including ALPA, ACPA, and Unifor, among others, with whom we met on a weekly basis throughout the pandemic. And I will add, I think it's of relevance to this group, that while we were meeting with our pilot associations weekly, the other groups did not meet as often. So we completely recognize the paramount importance of those organizations to the safe movement of passengers in Canada and the effective management of the pandemic crisis. Transport Canada also worked closely with other federal government departments, provinces and territories, Indigenous organizations, domestic and international stakeholders, and labor groups to advance the safe restart and the rebuilding of a competitive and a viable commercial air sector. That included working with the Canada Border Service Agency and the Public Health Agency of Canada to protect the health and safety of Canadians through safe, responsible, and compassionate management of the border with the United States and of other ports of entry into Canada. It included strengthening air passenger rights and taking steps to accelerate the adoption of advanced technologies, including right-touch travel, in order to rebuild public sector confidence and future prospects in the air sector. It included efficient and affordable travel options that connect regions and communities to each other and to international markets. And we also worked with international partners such as ICAO to develop a globally unified approach to support aviation recovery and improve crisis response for the future. Secondly, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, Transport Canada Civil Aviation issued over 300 exemptions and special authorizations from the Canadian aviation regulations, interim orders, and we also issued a number of COVID-related NOTAMs. Those supported the aeronautical industry, which was facing various challenges, including the closure of Transport Canada offices, travel restrictions, limited access to training facilities, and support for the return to work of employees. Exemptions and authorizations are issued when it is assessed that they are in the public interest and are not likely to adversely affect aviation safety or security. And I might add that input from organizations like ALPA related to exemptions and authorization was and is very welcome. The need for regulatory relief provided under global exemptions was reassessed at many occasions and is reassessed on an ongoing basis. Many exemptions have been reissued over time to extend regulatory relief where required, and many of them we're looking at codifying into our Canadian aviation regulations. Finally, even during the pandemic, Transport Canada continued to advance regulatory files. We followed our agenda while adjusting it to better accommodate the industry. We never lowered the safety stance, however, but instead we reprioritized work as needed. We have readjusted our work during the pandemic to deal with priorities and burdens. For example, we pre-published the work on runway end safety areas, or RESA, just as the pandemic began, and the comment period was extended to allow industry to review and provide comments. Several changes were made in response to comments received, for example, by reducing the number of airports initially required to comply with the passenger volume implications of the pandemic, and a change from a 3 years of data collection and 2 years to comply to a 2 years of data collection and 3 years to comply stance, responding to industry requests to allow more certainty and a longer lead time to start planning. Another example is the coming into force of the regulations concerning seaplanes. We extended this coming into force by 9 months as operators were severely impacted by the pandemic and would not have been able to continue operations when the existing orders came into force. Several smaller files were also advanced to ensure that the Transportation Safety Board of Canada recommendations were implemented. For example, we updated the definition of a safety belt. We also improved the minister's ability to respond to incidents and to ensure operators have adequate training programs in place, for example, training programs stemming from the Boeing 737 incidents. And we published several miscellaneous packages that provided additional clarity to the regulations and codified long-standing exemptions. Transport Canada continues to work on aligning safety management systems regulations for existing sectors with ICAO Annex 19, and we're improving and harmonizing the tools, processes, and instructor training to assess SMS requirements. As the pandemic evolves, we continue to review lessons learned and to adjust future responses to further strengthen our ability to ensure the safety and security of Canadians and those flying over Canada by working in close collaboration with all partners in the aviation sector. As an example, Civil Aviation is currently working in the digitization of medical files, which along with other measures such as additional staffing and better use of technology will help us process medicals faster. Some challenges in the short term. As the aviation sector transitions into an eventual COVID-19 endemic phase, new challenges are arising as to how Transport Canada balances the health and safety of the traveling public with the needs of the overall transportation system. The Canadian air sector has recently experienced a dramatic surge in passenger demand. In January 2022, air traffic was less than 40% of 2019 levels. By May, that grew to almost 80%, and that was ahead of the forecasts that we had. And while this is positive, the speed of the increase is placing pressure on our system, as seen in lengthy wait times for both outbound, so Toronto and Vancouver principally flights, and inbound flights, primarily in Toronto. This is not a purely Canadian issue, as other jurisdictions are currently experiencing similar challenges. We continue to work with airports, airlines, baggage handlers, and other partners to implement solutions to reduce delays at major airports. And the efforts from the federal government, such as moving our mandatory random testing, or MRT, if you haven't flown to Canada, out of airports for COVID-19, have had a positive impact as traveler wait times at major airports are decreasing. To conclude, I'd like to reaffirm that Transport Canada continues to prioritize the safety and security of all passengers. We will continue to review and adjust our safety measures to align with public health advice. We will continue to balance appropriate health and safety measures with the resumption of key activities and in support of Canada's economic recovery from the pandemic. We will continue to engage with stakeholders like ALPA on a regular basis as we collectively navigate and recover from the pandemic. And we will continue to build lessons learned and adjust responses to further strengthen our ability to ensure the safety and security of the traveling public. Our journey to destination over the past few years has been as challenging as safely landing an A310 in a 38-knot direct crosswind in Prestwick. That's a story I can tell later if anybody wants to hear it. And while trips like that one may have ended with a certain pilot dripping in sweat and with a mildly shaky hand on the tiller for the taxi in, those trips ended safely because that crew was highly trained, specialized, ready for everything that Mother Nature threw at them, and cognizant of the enormous responsibility and honor conferred upon them by the 150 plus passengers in the back, counting on us to get them back home to their loved ones. Crew concept made me a better and safer pilot. And with organizations like ALPA and my metaphorical regulatory crew, they'll make me a better regulator too. As a former full-time pilot, I'm humbled and I'm awestruck to be in the presence of so many experienced and talented aviators. And as a guy in the back of your aircraft now, I'm comforted to know that if our engine blows up on departure out of Denver, or we have a total electrical fail in the dead of night in northern Canada, you have the training and the expertise to get me home to my wife, sons, and beautiful granddaughters. It has been an honor to speak to you today. I have and I will trust my life to any of you because I know you'll get me to my destination safely. I'm proud to consider myself a member of your crew, and I look forward to working with ALPA, other professional organizations, operators, and other regulatory bodies to do my part to put in place the conditions for my granddaughters to continue your proud legacy and be the best darn pilots of their generation. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Yeah. Can you do some questions? Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I would love.
If there's any questions, happy to take them. No hard questions, please, though. Okay, just easy questions. I only got to a colonel in the Air Force, but I emphasized the general and director general. So general questions are good. Specific questions, I'll have to take notes and get back to you. But please, sir.
Hi there, J.C. Patchell, Canadian Aviation Safety Coordinator. I'm just wondering that given the growing number of disruptive passenger incidents in Canadian carriers, and the fact that over 50% of these incidents are related to the mask mandate compliance issue, and that COVID numbers are continuing to trend down, when can we expect the removal of the mask mandate for air travel in Canada and Canadian air carriers?
Thanks, JC. It's a great question, and we get that question often. And I'm going to preface my answer with you saying that when I was in the military, I was a personnel manager. We called it a career manager. And when I took over that job from full-time flying, the guy I was replacing said, "I'm going to give you one piece of advice. And listen to this, it's good advice." And his advice was never commit. So I'm going to follow that good advice today. I can't give you an exact date, but what I can tell you, and can I consider this a privileged platform, not for attribution, Chatham House rules, please? Okay, so what I can tell you, not for attribution, is that those discussions are happening at very senior levels within the government of Canada, and by senior I mean well above my pay grade. The issues that you have brought up, the disruptive passengers, have been highlighted to us by flight attendant unions, by pilot associations, by the VP Ops of many of the major airlines themselves. And I can confidently say to you, I can hand on heart say to you that a lot of the vice presidents of operations that we've spoken to have very vociferously advocated for that change. So that is very well understood. You also highlighted that COVID numbers are decreasing. I'm here, I'm not wearing a mask. I'm super comfortable not wearing a mask. Of course, I've had COVID 3 times, but your point is well taken. So I am a bureaucrat, and I'm going to be a bureaucrat here. I'm not going to give you an answer to your question, but what I will tell you is your points are very well understood. Those discussions are happening, and I expect a fairly definitive answer to your question to be published soon.
Thank you.
And I can't give you an exact date, but I can tell you that a lot of the orders are due for renewal or change at the end of this month. So I don't know what the government is going to decide, but I'm looking to see what happens at the end of this month when it's time to either make them more restrictive, roll them over, or make them less restrictive, because I think we'll get a good sense of that very, very soon.
Thank you.
Trying to be cryptic, I'm a bureaucrat, but I hope that helps. Any other questions?
Cook, Mr. Cook, we have a question from the text messaging that came in.
Oh, okay.
And it says, in the past 2 years since the implementation of the revised flight and duty time regulations, it is apparent that there are compliance issues at the airline level. What level of surveillance is being conducted, and is Transport Canada satisfied that the level of compliance is adequate?
Okay, that's a great question, and I'm super happy to receive it. For those who aren't aware of what Canada has done with relation to flight and duty times, we made a rather dramatic change in flight and duty times for our subpart 705, which is our sort of commercial air traffic operators, that came into force in December 2020, but we're really only seeing the impact of that on crewing kind of now because, you know, the industry was so reduced in late 2020, the volume was so down. I can tell you this, Transport Canada, you know what, I didn't give the rest of the backstory, so I apologize to my American colleagues here. So the essence of the regulation, the regulatory change, was that we reduced the maximum crew duty day, generally speaking, and we had sort of a sliding scale operation. So when I went to industry, when I left the service, I flew the ATR 42 for a short time into Saskatchewan, which is a western province of gravel strips, and you know, it blew me away that some of the pilots who were working for me would, you know, fly 10, 11 sectors in January in freezing precipitation on gravel runways. Like, you know, the fatigue was just, it was mind-blowing to me. I had spent my last time in the service, you know, flying from the Toronto area to, you know, to England at, you know, flight in the 30s, you know, sipping my coffee and periodically talking to Gander or Shanwick. So that was really resonated with me. And what Transport Canada has done is they have sort of a, for lack of a better term, a sliding scale. So, you know, if you're doing that Toronto to, you know, Dubai leg, you can fly a little bit longer in your day than if you're doing all those multiple sectors of, you know, 45 minutes or 50 minutes in the freezing precipitation, icing up, de-icing, refueling, and so on and so forth. And I, as a pilot, am a huge believer in that change, because I have flown, I will tell you again, Chatham House rules, I have flown exceptionally fatigued in the past in the military, and I think anything that makes it so that our crews are more refreshed, have better rest, and we recognize the stresses that they are under in the cockpit is good. There has been much pressure from industry, not from the associations, I would add, different kinds of pressure, but there's been much pressure from industry for us to revisit, to take a look at that, maybe roll back. I'm not going to name any names. And everybody's advocating for their own perspective, and we respect that. But I will tell you that at Transport Canada, there is absolutely no interest right now, unless we've missed something major, and I don't think we have, to doing that. So those rules are continuing. They'll be implemented in our subpart 703 and 704 operations this year. There's no intent to delay that because we think it's in the safety interest of the traveling public to move with that. We have been made aware. You know, there's always allegations of compliance, non-compliance, and we have a group within Transport Canada that looks at those things and investigates those, and they can take action on them. So we are aware of some allegations in that respect. Those are being examined, and they will be. And if operators are not complying with our regulations, they will be held to account. Plain and simple. Hope that answers the question.
Hey, thank
Yeah,
you.
for sure.
We have one more question,
Sure.
a text question, if there's time for it.
I got one too.
Okay.
At the working level, we are noticing that when events happen, SMS corrective actions are developed, but poor or no implementation occurs, and in some cases, disciplinary actions are taken. What can be done in terms of surveillance activity and recourse for employees, especially at smaller airlines, to correct these abuses of SMS?
Another excellent question. I don't have a definitive answer to that, and that is just simply because my understanding of the SMS system is that they're largely implemented at the company level, and I think that is exactly what the question is getting to. All I could suggest to the person who asked the question is if you have any specific details of that sort of thing, you can send it to me, andrew.cook@tc.gc.ca. I'm a public servant. I serve you. You're in the public. I'll be happy to move that along to the appropriate authorities. But I don't have a definitive answer or fix for that problem. We are very interested in enabling SMS to further increase aviation safety. We really believe in it. But I think part of the way that it's rolled out can make it challenging because it's a company by company situation as opposed to industry standard. So if there is an example of someone, a glaring, let's say, infraction, please send it to any Transport Canada employee, and we will look at it. But if you want to send it to me, send it to me.
Great. We have one over here.
One over here. Sir.
Andy, Peter Black, Chairman of Remotes Operations Committee. Just wondering if Transport Canada would consider a degree of collaboration with ALPA with regards to identifying northern airports, particularly northern Canada, obviously, that would be increased or enhanced to provide better recovery for aircraft that may be diverting there either for an emergency or medical alternate. And way out there would be something like Resolute, where there are a great deal of facilities on the ground. It's a matter of expanding and paving runways, et cetera.
Yeah, so you know that throughout my Air Force and my short time in the commercial sector actor, I have a fair, I would say, a reasonable amount of experience in Northern Canada. I share your concerns, and what I would say is that we are always open to having those conversations. Again, I'm gonna follow my advice of my predecessor in the military and not commit, but I will say that we are open to constructive dialogue. I know it sounds like a catchphrase, but I don't mean it that way. I really don't. Like anything that will increase the safety of passengers flying in Canada is of interest to us, and we would be very willing to give it due consideration, for sure.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Anybody else?
Joe's got one. This is going to be a hard
Yeah, I got
question,
one.
isn't it? It's going to be a hard one.
No, it's not going to be hard. Yeah, it's more, maybe it's a question you can answer. I'm not sure it's exactly in your area, but I think it is. Or at least you can comment on it.
For sure.
One of the things, that we've struggled with during the pandemic between what has occurred here in the United States and our brothers and sisters in Canada is some of the challenges that they faced during the pandemic in terms of, obviously, the recognition of the criticality that aviation plays in both our economies. Here we were able to have 3 airline-specific programs, right? $63 billion worth of aid to keep our pilots ready, keep the industry ready for recovery, and preserve a great deal of our economy and economic activity. And I know you had queues and other things up in Canada, but I know it's been tough on our members up there because there's been a significant number of furloughs. And then when you add in the other types of challenges that are related to aircraft manning, airline manning, like foreign worker programs, wet leasing practices and dry leasing practices, unequal foreign license validation programs. Can you help us with some of that? Because we're really trying for the next crisis, right? To not have to do that again, because it couldn't have helped, right, in the long run. I understand the philosophies might have been a little different in terms of the approach, but it's had a very severe effect on the airline industry and hence workers. So could you just
Sure, can comment on it for
Yeah,
sure.
please.
Thanks, Joe. And that was a tough question. But I expect nothing less from you. So thank you for that. Look, I mean, the honest answer is that as working in the Director General of Civil Aviation shop, our mandate is about aviation safety. It's about the Canadian aviation regulations, ensuring compliance and that. And so those broader government programs aim to support industries and they're not within our mandate. And I'm not saying, not my problem, talk to somebody else. But what I am saying, and it's just a reality, is that we in civil aviation were not directly involved in any of those decisions. And I tried to reference that in my speech, and if I didn't, some of the challenges that I was speaking to about Canada were exactly those challenges. We understand in civil aviation the immense pressure that the industry was under throughout the pandemic. We realized that there were differences in the approach south of the border to the approach taken north of the border. And, you know, as a former service member, you know, all you can do is highlight challenges, and those above you make decisions, and those above us made decisions. That is not to say that we were advocating in one particular direction or another, but it's only to say that the challenges and the differences were very well understood. There were a lot of organizations in Canada. AIAC would be one of them, ATAC. There's a broad number of organizations that were advocating for a different approach from the federal government. The federal government made the decision that it made, and you know, as a public servant, our job is to loyally support those decisions, and I do. But it did not go unnoticed that the industry was under tremendous pressure. I mentioned in the speech the resilience, and I really do want to emphasize that. Our Canadian organizations, I don't want to, you know, compare Canadian ones to American ones, but the Canadian organizations had to be incredibly resilient because the pressure they were under was phenomenal. And I'm so proud to be able to work with them. Although you know, if I had a check, well, I had a checkbook, but if I could have written a check that would have helped, Andy probably would have. But Andy definitely does not have that much money in his bank account. But you know, what we did, everything, the government of Canada did everything it could within the scope of its powers and within the directions that we had to assist the industry. And I'm proud of what we accomplished together. And I'm proud of what, you know, I know we're going to accomplish great things in the future. So again, I didn't exactly answer your question, but I do want you to know that the impact of the pandemic was very well understood. Yeah.
I knew that was going to be
Yeah, that's about as good as I could be.
Also, is there anybody here from Canada? Because I know there's a question about that we've been working on. We've been working on programs to enhance access into Transport Canada for pilot certification standards, for when we have a pilot that has to come, you know, has a medical problem, has to come back, and the time it takes. We have the same. By the way, we have the same problem here in the United States.
I know.
Do you have any?
Well, I can talk about medicals. There is one other question.
Yeah, let's let that one go first. But we're running out of time, I think. Well, we got 4 minutes.
Let's do it.
Oh, you know, I think he's well aware, Joe, of the issue that you just talked about. I just wanted to get up here and just in front of the room, thank Andy for coming down to Washington, D.C., attend the Air Safety Forum, and have Transport Canada with us. And for those of you who don't know, he had not traveled since early 2020. And so this is his first big trip. But not only did he come to Washington, D.C. and speak to us today, he came down early, and we were able to get a lot of good business done in private meetings, you know, with our ASO volunteers. And I truly want to thank you for taking the time out for a couple of days, getting that face-to-face discussions going again, Andy. And I know that Captain Tim Perry is really looking forward to working with you and whoever replaces Mr. Robinson there at Transport Canada. So thank you very much. And a round of applause for him.
Well, thanks. I can briefly get into the medical thing if you want me to. What is that, like 2 minutes? Thank you so much. I really appreciate the warm welcome, and I really do. And I just talked to Joe here. I'll just take just a second after that very warm round of applause, thank you, to talk about medicals. It's one of our most pressing challenges that we're facing right now in civil aviation. I can tell you that I, myself, and Nick, my former boss, have been on the hot seat at several briefings to the Minister of Transport and to the Deputy Minister, to his senior bureaucrat, on the subject of medicals. It has a lot of attention. We are having some notable success right now internally within Transport Canada with our IT folks who are sitting in their beanbag chairs with their triples in front of their computers and doing amazing things coding. We're going to have some good success. One of the biggest challenges we're facing right now is our IT system, and you can just give me the hook when it's time, Joe. Our IT system was designed in the 1990s, and it was designed at a time before 2022, when you can order something off Amazon and track it from the time you order and know exactly when it's going to arrive. And one of the problems, I faced it myself as a pilot, was just not knowing what's going on with your file. A lot of our pilots go into their medical examiners, and if they're super fit, they get a stamp on their aviation document, and they just carry on and they go flying, no problem. It's those people that have, a little medical issue or two that need that headquarters supervision on their file. And the big problem is they don't know what's going on with their file. So we have had some success. We're going to be rolling out an app or a portal or something with ones and zeros in it in the very near future that will allow people to at least track the status of their files. And we think that's going to be a big game changer for us. But we are behind the technological 8-ball on our aviation medical file support. So it's got a lot of attention from the senior bureaucrats. We've hired, I'm going to say, close to a dozen people in the last month or so to try to help to move those files faster. But even with all of that in place, the complexity of the pilot's file will determine the amount of time that it takes. And I know there's some great services that ALPA offers, AMAS. We talked about that yesterday. And we're going to do everything we can to work with our industry and professional association partners to try to speed that process along. And every doctor at Transport Canada wants to keep every pilot flying. They do, like all flight surgeons. And we got some challenges, but with your help, we're going to get through it. So thanks.
That's great. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks.
Listen, that was a really comprehensive report, so I know there was a lot of questions there. We really appreciate you taking the time to come down here. And on behalf of all our 66,000 pilots, and especially our Canadian pilots who are so dedicated and talented individuals, we really thank you. We hope you'll come back and see us again.
Love to.
Thank you
Thanks,
so
Joe.
much.
Appreciate it.
Thank
Thanks.
you.